So, hello everyone who's joined us already, and thank you for joining us for our latest Twitter Spaces event. Today, I'm joined by the wonderful Thierry, the new head of insight at Journey Further, and we'll be talking all about data in digital PR, kind of where to get it from, how to use it, and all of this kind of stuff. Thierry, I won't lie, we've had a number of questions come flying in on our Twitter since the Spaces was announced.
Lovely stuff. I like to hear that.
Apparently,
Good,
you're popular.
good, good. Well, I don't know where this has happened. This is also one of those things as well. Do you know when you step outside of your bubble and people go, "Who are you?"
I get it all the time.
Well, there, oh, yeah. Well, there we are. But yeah, much appreciated.
Oh, amazing. So let's dive in with the first question. Data-driven campaigns in digital PR can gain a lot of traction. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it all over socials with like other agencies. I know Rise do a great job of all of that stuff. But where do you get this data from?
Oh God. Well, that's a big one. That's my entire job role. So I've got a few places in terms of like where we start. I think the best place to kind of kick off with is, especially for your client, is understanding how people interact with their product or service, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for example, let's take one I love, and I know we've worked extensively on, and I know, me and Carrie tried to crack them one time, but maybe in the future. And it was Adzuna, and so Adzuna
Mm-hmm.
are like a jobs board aggregator, right? So they have on their banks about 2 million CVs, and people go on there to list jobs as well as find jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then if we put them in the context of how on earth we find data, if that's our client, I'd go through the process of being their customer. So when somebody comes on, what are they doing? What are they searching? How are they behaving? And what data points are they leaving behind for you to take advantage of? So in this
Yeah.
context, somebody has come on, they're looking for a job. They might want to spruce up their CV. So they'll upload their CV to see if there's any, spelling mistakes, etc., etc. Now, immediately that's a point of story, right? Because that person has left almost like a digital and data footprint that you can have a look at. So
Mm-hmm.
from that, you can learn all kinds of things from somebody's CV, right? So you can know how long people stay in jobs, what the average salary is. You can even start connecting dots because creativity, realistically, is just connecting things. It's just the extreme
Yeah.
ability to connect things. So then you can start to connect like average salary versus name, for example, which is when the how much does a Thierry earn kind of tool came about.
Yeah.
You then understand, where they went to university. So then you can know, right, well, if you went to Leeds University, you're more likely to earn more than if you went to Oxford or Cambridge. I wish. Um, but you can start connecting those things just based on how, the audience and the customers kind of interacted with the website. So I would start with your client first, get obsessed with how people kind of interact with it. But then in the wider world, there's loads of things. So big fan of BuzzSumo. That's really awesome in terms of understanding content topics and how well they're doing and how they're being shared cross social.
Mm-hmm.
Then also go to answer the public, understanding, the questions and queries that people have as a way
Love
of being
that
able.
tool.
Yeah, it's awesome, right? And it's a
Yeah.
never ending one for like content topics. It literally just never ends.
I know,
Um,
definitely. I always feel like it's forgotten about too, because everyone's like, oh, it doesn't have search volumes. Like, but think of all the
it's
questions.
so underrated, but I do think search volumes, it had its like I feel like each generation or every like year or something, there is like a year of something. And I
Yeah.
think search volumes definitely had its year. That blew up for a while because I remember when I joined Epiphany, it was all about surveys. Like I remember
Mm.
people used to spend thousands a month on those bad boys. But yeah, there's loads. Site search as well is great. You know what people are actually searching. When they come to your site, it's brilliant. You can find all kinds of stuff, everything from like product recommendations all the way to like
Hmm.
questions that you're clearly not answering. They can get content ideas from. And then I love things like Reddit. I'm just obsessed with Reddit. Don't get me wrong, I'm not like a super user. There's some people who are absolute machines at it, but I love it in terms of following other subreddits that produce beautiful illustrations of data.
Hmm.
So things like Information is Beautiful, Chart Daily, and it just gets your like juices flowing in understanding how somebody has, visualized that data and been able to create a story or a narrative that you can understand in just a picture. So then I go into their methodologies and understand where they got that data from and how can I connect something else that looks something similar to that, or even take their idea and make it bigger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I mean, going back to the point you made about using the client data in particular, I mean, do you use CRM data? Is it solely Google Analytics? Is it asking the client directly for kind of like sales or any other kind of information they might have that might not be on GA? Is it a combination of everything? Where do you kind of go to look for that?
It's a mixture of everything, if I'm honest with you. But the reason I say like go through the that customer journey and understand where people live, that kind of digital footprint, is because when you ask the client and say every single client you ask and say, can I have the data, can I have data, they go, yeah, well, we've got loads of data we can give to you, etc. And when the time comes to go, okay, give me the data, they go, well, what do you want? But then you're kind of like, well, I don't know what I don't know. I was hoping you as a client would know, right? But they don't. So then that's why you're going to kind of do your homework and go, could I please have your your analytics data and how, like, what pages people are landing on when they first come to your site, or what drives
Mm-hmm.
the most traffic, or what people are searching for. Because at that point, you've been in the customer journey, you understand that behavior, and that is a thing that is possible to track. Because another thing as well is I think we overestimate how much data clients actually have and what they actually track.
Yeah.
Like the amount of times you ask for a bit of data, they're like, "Yeah, sorry, we don't actually know our demographics." And I'm like, "Huh?"
Yeah, all the time.
And I'm like,
Especially onboarding. You're like, oh, so who's your target audience? I don't really know.
and they're
Oh,
like,
okay,
"No
cool.
idea." And I'm like, "Do you know what? It's commendable that you've even been able to grow a business as big, because
Mm-hmm.
that's something to that's a mean feat." Um, but yeah, that's what I would do. It's a mixture of both. As I say, go through the customer journey, understand where those digital footprints are, and also pain points. Like, what is it maybe that they're not, giving their client, they're giving their customers, that you can maybe even suggest as a product, that you guys can run. So yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
then be super creative with it. So I know people struggle with like the idea of numbers being creative, but once again, creativity is just connecting things that otherwise may not have been connected. So um have a little think about the story first, and then see if that numerical value is there for you to be able to create that narrative. So don't get bogged down, don't sit in a sugar ton of data and think, oh, I will be inspired if I just sit in this ball pit of
Yeah.
numbers. um just go and kind of, yeah, do that customer journey, become obsessed with the client and what they would like to kind of achieve, what is that story, and then go back and find that numerical, the numbers you need to make it, basically.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, maybe not so much recently, but kind of going back towards the end of last year in particular, all over Twitter, is accuracy of data.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that data is really accurate, it's real, and it's newsworthy, particularly if you're looking at things like Reddit as a kind of a data source? How do you make sure that it is real?
Yeah, so then this is where you've got to balance credibility and inspiration, right? So there are some sources where they are purely for inspiration. So your Reddit, realistically, because what you got to think about as well is, like, when you're looking at data, is this representative to the wider population? Like, the thing that I'm seeing, would this happen in the wider world? And is there a big enough sample size to look at that? So if we're looking at Reddit and I'm looking at, trying to get inspiration for data, and some people have come up with a bit of a narrative around something, I can't then say, oh, based on the opinions of these three people, I'm now going to create this story, because those three people don't represent what the wider population looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Which is probably why surveys were a massive thing for a long while, because you could quite literally pay to have the opinions of a representative sample. So then you
Mm-hmm.
could go out with that data and say, oh, X% of people behave like this, because you've got a large enough sample size to be able to say, to a degree of um, accuracy and confidence, that this thing would be seen in the wider world. So, as I say, things like Reddit, inspiration. Like, I even go to Twitter for inspiration as well, because, a lot of people tweet their thoughts and tweet their opinions, and it's a great place to go and, gather inspiration as to topics and how people are conversating around a certain thing. Or even if, just even checking if people care about a story that you're about to run. Like, is
Yeah.
this a thing people give a monkey's about? And then, yeah, the credibility end as well is, you've just got to ask yourself, do I have a large enough sample size or data to that this opinion or topic will exist in the wider world and represent the views of general public.
Hmm.
So yeah, credibility and inspiration, very fine line.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, talking of sample sizes, is there a rule of thumb with sample sizes, or is it really dependent just on the topic and the kind of data you're trying to collect?
Yeah, it is. So, so my background is in like academia, so I have to
Hmm.
answer it two different ways because I remember when I came and I started doing data for digital PR back in the day, and I came from an academic background. They were like, "Oh, Thierry, we need you to collect data on this," and I did a whole, hypothesis and H1, H2, and did all statistical analysis, and they were like, "Fella, we just want to know whether people want to go on holiday or not, right? You're not doing your PhD." Um, and so yeah, digital PR is it is far removed from academia. So in terms of a rule of thumb, it's a tough one. So journalists usually would guide you on this a lot of times because they understand what they're kind of looking for. So I remember when I first joined as well, like 1,000 sample size used to be fine and representative.
Hmm.
But what quickly happened then is from 1,000 sample size, if you cut down an opinion and you go, well, I want to look at how people who identify as female answered to this specific question, you might actually only have 50 opinions there. And 50 opinions, you can't then go out and go female Brits believe this because it's just
Yeah.
not large enough in any way, shape, or form. So then it's then increased to about 2,000 so that your natural fallout will end up being like 100 to 200 opinions, even when you cut it down. And that's where I think is a threshold. I rarely go below 200 if I've gone through like females who have clicked this and also believe that. Um, if your sample size allows, if you're using tools like YouGov Profiles, for example, which has like 300,000, then you should never really go below like what 500, 600
Hmm.
as a sample size. But yeah, like you'll know 50, hell no, 100, no. I'd still be looking at like your 200, 250. Hence why you need a really big headroom on your um, survey to begin with, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So when it comes to kind of the amount of data that you're collecting for a campaign, is there kind of, I mean, how heavy is too heavy is really my question. How heavy is too
Yeah.
heavy when it comes to a data led campaign?
Um, to be honest, I think it can make or break a campaign, like how much data you've got. I think some people think the more the merrier. I really, really don't. You just have to be loyal to the story because does it tell the story? And also I know like a couple of agencies have things like um they're like mum test where it's like, does your mum actually be able to comprehend this?
Hmm.
So let's say we're doing what's typically quite heavy, like an index. That's usually quite data heavy. I've seen indexes that are like 8 to 10 like variables, and I'm like,
Wow.
how on it's physically not possible because what you got to think about is in order for somebody to engage with the data that you've produced, they have to be able to hold and retain all the information you've given them in one view, right? So if you think about it from a sense of how many pieces of information you can retain at any given time,
Hmm.
you're looking at like two or three at any given time that somebody can, like an attention span can retain. So if you've got an index of like 6 to 8, it's just not possible. And I do appreciate that, from a digital PR perspective, you're thinking the more variables, the more angles, but just cut it down from the index and use it in the content. Like you'll actually enrich the content by taking it away from the index and
Yeah.
just having like maximum, like five, even five. Sometimes I'm like, whoa, it's a bit overwhelming. Like three or four in variables, and then cut the other data into the content so that you're pointing them towards stuff and going, well, this city or thing came number one. Did you also know that it is the best for this, which is another
Hmm.
variable you brought in? Um, so yeah, I do think there is such thing as too much data. Um, similarly, even outside digital PR, not even outside actually, no, like reporting for digital PR too.
Yeah.
I do think it can be quite heavy where you get like these data studio reports or whatnot, which I've got everything from click through rates to like traffic to this to that. right, what are your KPIs? What are you actually bothered about? Like,
Yeah.
what is actually success? If you set that right at the beginning, then you're actually laughing, and you've only got like what 4 or 5 metrics outside of pure play links to talk about that you actually care. So yeah, and that comes into the whole measurement strategy type stuff, which is essentially to cut down how bloated some things can be. God's honest truth, if you can't load it on your computer, it's too much.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, something slightly different. We was all trying to open a massive disavow Excel file the other day, and we were like, "Yeah, this is too much."
Honest, it's when you start talking about data warehousing, then I'm like, look,
Oh,
just delete it all.
yeah. Okay, so obviously going into it from a data analyst perspective, kind of a head of insights perspective, you don't want to be kind of swamping yourself in data in order to get those prime ideas, but you're probably much more used to looking at the data, understanding data in terms of kind of what is a good idea, what comes out of that in terms of creative campaign. But how do you then make that data really digestible for journalists who may not be so kind or maybe so happy about a massive Excel sheet of like loads of numbers and stats coming across to them? How do you tend to then format that to make sure that you're getting the right data across for the right story?
Yeah, so realistically, I wouldn't. It's one of those things where which I picked up from Carrie and Will and the gang, in terms of like making sure you've optimized your headlines, for example, right? So if you've got a lot of data, the last thing you want to do is like copy and paste that into the body of an email and send that out. That is a
Mm-hmm.
nightmare. Imagine somebody getting that headache. So what you've got to do here is understand what are the maybe 3 things that you think make that data and the story you put together incredible. And then what you should do then is then scatter that within your subject headline, for example, and then your intro press release, right in the couple of lines that you're kind of introing to the journalist. Because realistically, what you're doing is you're teasing them into the larger content.
Yeah.
So don't hit them with everything straight away. Make sure that it is genuinely just 3 things that you need. And if the campaign isn't good enough to pull 3 things out of, then it will never make it realistically. Um, so yeah, really, really kind of cut it down, make it super digestible. Also link back to your data sources and methodologies. So
Mm-hmm.
once a journalist is kind of hooked in, a lot of them are quite data literate. And they do want to understand how it was put together, and they also know how to check for credibility and whether something is robust.
Yeah.
So have that all in there within your press release and your outreach email as well, so that they don't have to come back to you and go, "Oh, by the way, can you send the data?" If
Oh,
they get like
yeah.
500 emails a day, they haven't got time for that.
Could you imagine?
You know what I mean?
You'd never get anything live if you had to do that every
No,
single time.
impossible. And then also like send them like give them a link to like a Dropbox file as well, where you have put together your visual assets that are
Mm-hmm.
going to be either if it is on-site content, so that it helps them also understand how you've taken that data and visualized it yourself. So it can do one of 2 things. They might use your assets, or it might inspire them to create their own as well, in a similar format. But it just means that you are conveying to them the story and not
Yeah.
letting them come up with a random narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, no, just keep it. I always feel like with data and journalists, it's very much a bit of a flirting game, in the sense of show them enough for them to understand and be attracted by the story. Once a story is in, amazing. Here is everything else you needed to know around it and how I put it together and how I came to this narrative.
Definitely. I guess if you can make a journalist excited about your story, then chances are once it does go live, or even if they kind of tweak the angle a little bit, that's going to probably get a lot of traction. Because if they're
Yeah,
excited, the readers are probably going to be excited too.
yeah, absolutely. And have a little look as well as to like when they have written like previous data-led stories, like how have they led that narrative, or how do they visualize things, or how do they talk about it? So like for example, because then what ends up happening there is you'll get to a point where journalists come to you for data if you almost write and create data in their style. So hence why when I was at Rise, and I'm kind of doing at the moment at Journey Further as well, is I've always tweeted like bits of insight.
Yeah.
Even myself and George and the team and everything, we always put out insight. Now that does one of 2 things. It inspires, our the community that we're in, for sure, but also there comes a point as well where a journalist will see that and go, "Oh my God, amazing! Yes, I would love to talk about that specific story," or
Mm-hmm.
"Can you elaborate on this?" or "Can I use your data for a wider narrative?" And then now you've got a relationship with a journalist who will come to you directly for data, and you're no longer outreaching. So you can kind of reverse that conversation. So I know a lot of people think, oh, it's just Thierry tweeting out random bits of insight, whatever else. But you know, it's making sure that whoever sees that has me in their mindset in a specific way. So when
Yeah.
that time comes, yeah, it comes to you.
Okay. Okay. I like it. So obviously, day to day, you're staring at lots of data, you're doing lots of research, you're in CRMs, you're in Google Analytics, you're looking at all of these different data sets, left, right, and centre. How easy is it to pick out a narrative within the data? And how often do you actually hit a wall rather than coming across a hidden gem?
It's actually solid to hit to get to get a narrative with the data, which is why I always say, like, don't just sit in it, don't
Yeah.
just sit in the data. Come with a narrative. Come, like, even at brainstorm. So I've always said that analysts should always go to brainstorms, and they'll provide ideas, and you can vet it pretty much on the fly and say, actually, that won't work because data is not collected in that way or whatever
Yeah, I
that
guess you
might
can
be.
look at the how realistic that kind of thing actually is.
Yeah, because when you think about it, then if that was the case, that if we sat in data all the time, that means that if you ever came to one of my brainstorms, all I would do is go, here is 18 tabs of data. Please, let's find a story. Impossible. And also, nobody wants that job. That is horrendous. But what I always say is just come up with the idea and then go vet it. If it doesn't work, that's fine. I just think that you'd hit more walls trying to find a narrative inside data than coming up with an idea and then fact checking it. Because, even in brainstorms, we'll come up with 20 ideas. We'll go back, we'll go, right, 10 of them are data led. Amazing. Of these 10 that are data led, what is possible and what has the strongest narrative? Go away, test it. Oh, by the way, there's 5 of them. Here you go. We're off.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'd said, here are 100, I saw JBH did a really cool article where it's like 200 data sources.
Hmm.
Imagine sitting through 200 data sources and trying to find a story.
Gosh, killer.
Nightmare, nightmare. So just come up with your story, which you've come up with by going through the customer journey or being plugged into what's going on in the wider world. So what is trending, what are people talking about, um, and then see how you can make that relevant with data. Now, also don't just plug data in. If it doesn't need it, it doesn't need it,
Yeah,
realistically.
that's exactly what I was going to be. Maybe a next question or just the next kind of statement in that how often do people just use data for the sake of it when it's not even needed?
Yeah, because it became a bit of a buzzword. I think within digital PR, being like data led digital PR, data led content, and things like that, because we realized that journalists had a greater affinity to it, essentially, and were produced a lot more stories that were picked up because of that, and also journalists clocked on to if you could find a contentious stat, not Brits aren't as numerically literate as you think, and so then it creates a more contentious story which people are more likely to read.
Hmm.
And so then that has just perpetuated that kind of machine. But yeah, if it doesn't have it, just if it doesn't need it, then it honestly doesn't need it. Digital, I mean, PR existed way before data. The Not way before data, but as in like way before the two came together. So if something doesn't need it, then it honestly doesn't need it. Like the amount of creative campaigns that we executed over the last 2 years that didn't need data is absolutely phenomenal.
Hmm.
Data is very much a supplement or the vehicle to convey a story in a more succinct way.
Yeah.
Um, so if it's necessary, put it in. If it's not, do not force it. And
Hmm.
also, if you find a piece of data and it's not saying what your story wants to say, then just leave it. Put it down. Don't play with it.
Yeah.
Don't try. Don't try and make it fit.
Don't force it. Exactly. So we've spoke quite a bit about digital PR, but where else in either an agency or just in a business overall can being data first really make a difference?
I think one of the biggest growth areas for me and my the thing that I want to achieve this year is to infuse and inspire creative teams with data. I think that is the biggest growth area because I think a lot of other teams have, by the sheer nature of their roles, they they have data flowing through them. So social, naturally, they have to analyze what people are talking about, what's trending. PPC teams, naturally, what's
Hmm.
converting, what's working, SEO, by the nature, they're basically, scientists to a degree. Um, so, yeah, I think a lot of the other teams do have um, data as a natural given, but I think the greatest growth areas is in creative teams. And the thing that I say I want to crack, I am cracking at the moment is how do we have a data-led creative approach? So how do we infuse data and say, this is what I understand about my audience, this is how they behave online, and so therefore this is the creative output that we believe will resonate best with this audience type.
Hmm.
And I think the smart thing about that, and I reckon the reason maybe the creative teams have maybe not worked so closely with data teams previously, is because it takes a data team to understand what all the other teams are doing in order to help inform creative.
Yeah.
Because realistically, I need to know, what are people searching, how they're interacting on our website, what are the core demographics, do segmentation pieces and go, right, okay, our audience over indexes for this behavior and that behavior. They're more likely to be vegan, they're more likely to be Gen X, etc.
Hmm.
In order for us to then be able to then tell, right, with the creative team, this is who you're targeting, and these people, you know, love to see this kind of creative, and that resonates with them really well.
Yeah.
You almost have to run around the houses to help them. But yeah, I think the great sort of growth areas is if you can bring data and the creative team together, you're absolutely laughing.
Yeah, I think it will just help to really pinpoint audiences a lot more, like you were saying. I mean, if you can really hone in on who that audience is for every single angle, so it's not just SEO, it's not just PPC, it's not just PR, but just what the overall branding is doing, then yeah, you're laughing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's a great brand building exercise because James Alston always talks about, sales overnight, but brand over time. And that's exactly what we're trying to build here by infusing, the data team and keeping them as close as humanly possible with our creative team. Like I literally sit next to our executive creative director to make sure that even by osmosis and diffusion, we'll inspire we'll inspire each other. So yeah, I honestly think it's going to be an incredible thing to happen in the next couple of years.
Definitely, yeah. And I think you're right in that just over time, it's where the industry is going to have to go.
Yeah, it really, really does. And also it really does in a sense of like, I think old traditional media, was mass media for a reason. It wasn't super targeted. It had an audience to an extent, but it just goes to show the popularity of creative and digital PR agencies at the moment, because we are able to understand and track our audience in real time and create creatives that are bespoke to a certain demographic of individuals. And we can do that at pace and measure at pace. And so that's why I think, the big old advertising agencies are kind of a bit like, oh my God, look at all these new creative offerings. What can we do? And they're kind of slow to the bat at the moment.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So we're coming up to the half hour mark. Twitter Spaces always gets a bit funny around half an hour, 40 minutes in. So I'll do the last question just so it doesn't kick us off, because that has happened about 3 or 4 times before. Um, so what advice would you give to other marketers looking to sink their teeth into data? And do you have any other top tips that you can give?
Um, into data, I mean, I'll be specific to digital PR. I think the greatest top tip is actually that other people's methodology is a way to start. I think there's this weird thing where people are like, an idea has to be new and novel and never done before. And it's like, well, no, an idea is it's a kaleidoscope of ideas. And all you're doing is just, moving that image around to create a completely different narrative. So use other people's methodologies. It will inspire you to the end of the earth. In terms of getting into data, follow the right people. Twitter is the best place for it. Follow people who create, information is beautiful, chart daily, people who already create narratives with data so that you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to sit in it and think about it. Let them do the creativity, which is incredible. Sign up to newsletters. I know Iona runs an incredible one, content curated as well. And there's a few other ones floating around that are amazing, that kind of give that inspiration. Digital PR tips, digital PR examples, etc., who tweet that kind of content. Get obsessed with that. And let other people inspire you. Like you don't have to always go and sit in the data and think of the ideas. Let those things come to you as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Amazing.
And
Yeah.
then I think the last one is if it's too good to be true, probably is
It's good
when
to
it comes
know.
to data. Yeah,
Definitely. Don't try and find a gem when it just isn't there.
that's it. That's it. Because there's nothing worse. We've seen a couple of times where like there's nothing worse than being caught out, man. It's awful. So it ain't nobody got time for that. And also my DMs are always open, as I say, like if you guys want any advice or even just a bit of inspiration, I'm always there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining, T. It's been really fun going through everything, not just about PR, obviously, but everything to do with data.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. This is the very first one I've like really hosted, which is quite cool.
Yeah,
There's
it's
probably
fun,
loads of
right?
people slagging me off while they're cooking the spag bowl, but
Well, yeah, at least this time we didn't catch you while you was cooking, like we did
yeah,
before.
this is also true. This is also true. But yes, no, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. And we'll definitely do it again soon. And thank you everyone for listening in. Keep an eye out on our socials for our next one.
Peace.